Hi, my name is Brian Hawley, and I'm going to speak to you about the effects of peak oil on the health system. This is for the LUT1, Task 2. Imagine, if you will, what it would be like if we lost much of what we take for granted for our health. If there were no ambulance services or medical drugs, if syringes, bandages, heart valves, and most other medical supplies became largely unavailable. What would it be like if the basic staples of our health was unreliable and priced out of reach of even upper middle class America? You may be surprised to learn that this is a likely scenario once global oil production peaks and begins its decline, unless energy issues are brought to the forefront of healthcare reform discussion. You may be even more surprised to learn that nearly all predictions today place peak oil production between 2005 and 2030. Health issues related to peak oil is imminent and will be our health system's greatest challenge. But let's be clear here. The world is not about to run out of oil. Oil extraction, whether it's a single field, a nation, or even globally, will always follow a bell curve. Oil may be extracted at increasing rates to meet growing demand until about half the oil is depleted. When that point, called peak oil, is passed, no matter what you do, you cannot extract oil at the same rate, creating a widening gap between supply and demand. Reliance of modern health and healthcare on petroleum is immense. The most obvious effect of rising costs or interrupted oil supplies on transportation. Emergency services such as ambulance, donor organ transport, and supply chains come to mind. But let's not forget less obvious effects of transportation on our health. Visiting nurses, commuting healthcare workers, health inspectors, among others. Fuel rationing in the 1970s affected all these points and may do so again. But it's medical supplies and equipment that may see the greatest impact from scarce or very expensive oil. Nearly all the equipment used today, everything from gloves to life support systems, dishes to catheters, tubes, bandages, jellies, and balms are all petroleum-based. Pharmaceuticals, such as aspirin, antihistamines, antibiotics, tablet binders, and pill coatings are all derived from petroleum. Again, in the 1970s oil crisis, we saw delays in delivery of medical equipment due to shortages in the petroleum needed to manufacture that equipment. This equipment and these supplies make a cornerstone of modern medicine. Shortfalls, ever-increasing prices, and hampered transport will all have a negative effect on our health. There are a number of things that can be done, however, to lessen the impact and ease the transition to a less oil-dependent future. Dr. Howard Frumkin and his colleagues have recently offered some suggestions. These include stockpiling known risk items and equipment, including fuel, at hospitals, building scenarios for both acute shortages and chronic shortages of fuel and equipment, reforming the National Alliance for Energy Contingency Planning for Health Resources, a group created in 1980 after the fuel shortages of the late 70s, and to create partnerships within the community. An example is Portland, Oregon's Peak Oil Task Force. Public health officials have been largely absent from discussions of energy issues. That must change so we can face the obvious and not so obvious connection between a possible rapid and imminent crisis in public health. As geologist Walter Youngquist states, reaching and passing the peak of world oil production will be the most important happening in human history to date, affecting more people in more ways than any other event. It will happen and ruin the lives of most people now living. Thank you. Any questions?
What about new oil discoveries? Isn't there plenty of oil in Canada?
For discoveries, evidence shows oil discovery has peaked over 40 years ago. 98 of the 100 largest reserves were discovered prior to 1970. Oil discoveries today tend to be small, deep, and expensive to retrieve. The Canadian tar sands are a good example. Oil from the tar sands must be strip mined, shipped, and processed. It's very expensive and time-consuming. But even if that was not the case, according to David Hughes of the Geological Survey of Canada, the amount of retrievable oil is, and I quote, meaningless when it comes to offsetting declines in conventional oil production. So in short, no, new discoveries will not keep pace with the demand gap.
People have been predicting peak oil for years. Why is this time any different?
Previous claims were not backed by as much evidence as we have today. Even the oil industry is acknowledging the problem. Dr. Ganem, the 2006 Petroleum Executive of the Year, said to his colleagues while accepting the award that peak oil could only take place, or peak oil could take place sometime in the next decade, which in fact means there's not much time left for a world economy to be driven largely by oil. If they believe it, perhaps we should too.
And what about new technologies?
It's a great question. New technologies can ease us in the transition, but they need to be developed now. Pharmaceuticals, for example, can be made with non-petroleum-based materials. The problem is that it's time-consuming and expensive, not to mention that any changes to a drug formula need to be approved by the FDA. Also, there really is no visible large-scale replacement for oil in the transportation sector. Biofuels, for example, are too resource and land intensive. Electric power is useful for only limited forms of transport. So there's really not much out there. So to hope for a new technology is not really a strategy.